All right, in these next examples, these next problems for example 2, we're going to use our knowledge of even and odd functions to determine what value I'll get back for certain if my unknown is a negative or a positive. So I'd like to, when we're looking at our sine function, remember sine is an odd function. Sine is odd. What that means, if we plug in a negative value, the entire sine function is going to be negative. That's what it means to be an odd function. What this means, if I wanted to find, I'm just kind of going off on a little tangent here, but this is what it means. So if we say, let's find the sine of negative 3. You know, first off, it'd never be negative 3 because it'd need to be a fraction. So let's say negative 0.3. That's going to give us a value of negative sine of 0.3. Okay? Now let's look back at this actual problem. What this problem says is I'm going to plug some value in to theta, and it's going to give me a negative value out. So that means I know whatever I plugged into theta has to be negative. So when I'm looking at this, to get a negative out, I know theta has to be negative. And it has to be negative because to get a negative out, we plug in a negative. Okay, so if I'm plugging in, now they want us to find the sine of negative theta. All right, let's come down here and work on this. Well, we already know sine of theta is a negative number. That means theta has to equal a negative number. And what negative value? It's going to be negative 0.245. Okay, so we know theta is negative. So I'm going to plug in negative theta into this sine function. So the sine of negative theta, and there's two negatives because there's a negative to begin with right here, and then the negative from there is going to be the sine of 0.245. And so then we end up with 0.245. Boom. That's all we're doing. We're trying to find out the sine of the value of what got plugged in. All right, let's try the next one. If sine of theta is negative 0.245, let's find the cosecant of theta. Well, cosecant of theta is going to be, cosecant is 1 over sine. Sorry, I just had a little brain fart there. So we know what sine is. Sine is negative 0.245. So cosecant of theta is going to equal 1 over, oops, I forgot to put the theta. Got to put the theta. Negative 0.245. And I don't normally like fractions inside decimals inside fractions. So let's figure this out. 1 divided by 0.245 in our calculator. We're going to find out that the cosecant of theta is about 4.0816. Let's try another one. So we know cosine is an even function. Cosine is even. What does that mean? It means if I have a negative cosine, I plug in a negative value, we are going to get out a positive answer. So if cosine is positive 7.885, well, what happens when we plug in negative 0.7885? Well, we're going to get out an even value, so 0.7885. So if we had plugged in a negative, well, I'm not actually plugging in the 0.7885. I'm plugging in some value, and it's giving me, when we plug in some value, we get out a positive 0.7885. I plug in the negative of that value, we're still going to get out a positive 7885. I think I misspoke a little bit with the sign. I don't know what I'm plugging in. But when I plug in a negative, it's going to give me a positive for cosine because cosine is an even function. Same with the sine. Let's look back. Let me fix up that note a little bit. I didn't plug in a negative 0.2445. I didn't actually plug it in. I plugged in something. And it gave me, I plugged in some value and it gave me a negative out. That means whatever I plugged in was negative. So if I take whatever I plugged in and it was negative and I made it negative, again, that would be plugging in a positive. If I plug in a positive, I get out a positive. So what we didn't actually plug this in. What we did is we plugged in a negative theta. So let's fix that up. My note should have been a little tighter on that. I apologize. So again, we know what cosine of theta is. Cosine of theta is 0.7885. Let's find the secant of theta. Well, how do we find the secant of negative theta? Well, secant is 1 over cosine. Well, we already said earlier, we know what cosine of negative theta is. If I plug in some negative value right here, let's say we said we're going to plug in some negative value. We're going to plug in some negative value of theta. I don't know what it is. I'm going to plug in a negative value, and that's going to give me out a positive 0.7885. We've already said that. So we're going to do 1 over 0.7885. And that's going to get, I don't like decimals inside my fraction, so I'm going to give it all as 1 decimal. And that's going to get about 1.2682. All right, let's, that's example 2, but I think that we have enough time because I only get about 15 minutes on these videos. Let's try number 3. Let's find negative x, so we're going to find f of negative x and determine whether each function is even or odd. So what happens is, what this means is every x becomes a negative x. So we're actually going to find the function of my negative x value. So every x becomes a negative x. And to determine if this is even or odd, if I plug in a negative and I get out a negative, if I plug in a negative and it returns a negative, we are odd. If I plug in a negative and we get out a positive, we're going to be even. All right, so we know, so f of negative x, cosine of negative x, that's an even function, so cosine of negative x just becomes cosine of x. Negative x, nothing's going to happen with that. If the bottom's negative, what that means is the whole thing is negative. 1 negative in our fraction, which lets me know this is an odd function. There we go. Example 3b, we're going to do the same thing. Let's take out all the x's and put in a negative x. So I'm going to have negative x times the sine of negative x times cosine of negative x. Well, negative x is just going to be negative x times sine of negative x is negative sine of a positive x, Cosine of negative x is just cosine of x. So now I have a negative times a positive. So that's going to be a positive x, sine x, cosine x. I ended up with the function that I started with. When I plug in a negative, I ended up with my original function. That means we are even. Odds, the signs change. I plug in a negative, I get out a negative. Even, I plug in a negative and I get out my original function. Alrighty, so that's where we're going to leave off. We're going to do examples 2 and 3. We're going to come back and knock out 4 and 5. I just want to make these videos a little shorter. That's why I'm breaking them down, and you can find exactly the spots you need.